Hello and good morning. I'm studying a lesson from history. This is chapter 5, Through the Eyes of Travelers. Perception of society, that is from 10th to 17th century. This chapter has 7 topics. Number 1, Al-Biruni and the Kitabul Hind. Number 2 is Ibn Battuta's Rihala. Then Francois Bernier, a doctor with a difference. Number 4 is Making Sense of an Alien World, Al-Biruni and the Sanskritic Tradition. Topic number 5 is Ibn Battuta and the Excitement of the Unfamiliar. Number 6 is Bernier and the Degenerate East. And the last one is Women, Slaves, Sati and Laborers. People started their traveling for different purposes as they felt its importance in search of to keep themselves from natural disaster, as traders, merchants, soldiers, priests, pilgrims, etc. Many people traveled for adventure. No accounts of travel left by women, whether it's mentioned that they traveled, we are not sure. Abdul Razak Samarkandi, a diplomat, visited Vijayanagar in the 15th century from Herat. In the context of this lesson, it is to know that how the knowledge of the past may be enhanced through the consideration of description of the social life described and provided by various travelers who came to the subcontinent. Let us come to enrich our knowledge. So we reach the first topic. It is Al-Biruni and the Kitabul Hind. This chapter is divided into 2 parts. Number 1, from Khwarizm to the Punjab, and the other one is the Kitabul Hind. So let us see the first topic. This is Al-Biruni and the Kitabul Hind. So from the Khwarizm to Punjab. So let's see what is this all about. Al-Biruni was born in 973 AD in Khwarizm, Uzbekistan. It was an important center of learning. He was a scholar of many languages as Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew and Sanskrit. Al-Biruni was the most prominent mathematician, philosopher, astrologer and historian at the center of Muhammad Ghaznavi. His original name was Muhammad bin Ahmad Abu Rayyan, but he is generally known as Al-Biruni, meaning the master. He was brought to Ghazni in Sultan Muhammad's time, either as a prisoner or as a hostage. He entered the service of Muhammad in AD 1017 when he was about 45 years of age. He had much love for learning since his childhood. Samas ud-Din Muhammad tells that he was so much devoted to learning that he stopped writing for only 2 days in a year. He was always busy studying books and acquiring knowledge. He learned Sanskrit and studied religious and philosophical texts accompanying with Brahmin priests and scholars. Al-Biruni came to India with Muhammad Ghazni and lived in Punjab for several years. While in India, he learned Sanskrit and made a thorough study of Hindu philosophy and other branches of Indian science. The result of his literary and scientific research he embodied in his work entitled Kitabul Hind, which means an inquiry into India. The Kitabul Hind is the next subtopic. So Al-Biruni's work, Kitabul Hind. So let's see what is it all about. Al-Biruni wrote his account of India in his famous book Kitabul Hind. It is simple and lucid. It is voluminous text divided into 40 chapters on many subjects such as religion and philosophy, festivals, astronomy, alchemy, manners and customs, social life, weights and measures, iconography, laws and metrology. Generally, Al-Biruni adopted a distinctive structure in each chapter. He begins with a question, following this up with a description based on Sanskrit traditions, and concluding with a comparison with other cultures. Some present-day scholars are of the view that this almost geometric structure, remarkable for its precision and credibility, owed much to his mathematical orientation. The purpose of writing his account in Arabic was to write for the people living on the frontiers of the subcontinent. He was familiar with translation and adaptation of Sanskrit, Pali and Prakrit texts into Arabic. These books range from fables to works on astronomy and medicine, but he was also critical about the ways in which these texts were written and really wanted to improve on them. Ibn Battuta's Rihla. This part is divided into two subtopics, an early globe trotter and the other one is the enjoyment of the curiosities. In this part we will be reading about an early globe trotter, especially which is termed towards Ibn Battuta. So let's see first of all who was he and what did he do. He came to Delhi in 1333 after having made extensive tours in Egypt, Palestine, Arabia and Persia. He was a great theologian, and on his arrival in India, Muhammad Tughlaq conferred upon him the office of Chief Qazi of the state. Ibn Battuta had an excellent opportunity of making personal observation of the king's court and its daily working, which he recorded in his book. He also gives us much information about the social condition of the country. In 1342, he went to China as Sultan's messenger to the Mongol ruler. There he lived in Maldives as a Qazi for 18 months. Further, he went to Sri Lanka. Then he returned to his home in 1347, after which we came to know that he had faced lots of problems during his journey. So we came to the next topic. This is the enjoyment of curiosities. Here we came to know that he was a very inveterate traveler who spent his several years for traveling throughout North Africa, West Asia and many parts of Central Asia. Then he spent a great part of his life in making his journey through all these places. So when he returned, some of his local rulers told him that he should record his stories. Now we reach the third topic of the chapter. It's Frances Bernier, a doctor with a difference, and it has got one subtopic, that is comparing East and West. Of all the European travelers who have recorded their impressions, Bernier's account is most popular. He was a learned French physician who visited India from 1656 to 1668. He was highly educated and possessed an acute sense of observations. So here we came to know that Jesuit Roberto Nobili translated Indian texts into European languages. Duarte Barbosa, a Portuguese writer, wrote the informations about trade and society in the southern India or South India. After which 1600, that is after 1600, large number of travelers came to India from Dutch, English and French. Now John Baptiste Tavernier, French jeweler, was among them. He visited India 6 times. He was influenced by the Indian trading conditions. In this regard, he compared India with Iran and Ottoman Empire. Now Manushi was an Italian doctor. He became the Indian inhabitant. Now Frances Bernier, a Frenchman, was a doctor, political philosopher as well as an historian. Now he lived in India from 1656 to 68 and attached to Mughal court as a physician to Prince Dara Sukho, the eldest son of Emperor Shah Jahan. Comparing East and West, this is our new topic. Here what we saw is that Bernier traveled to several parts of the country and wrote accounts of what he saw, frequently comparing what he saw in India with the situation in Europe. Most of his writing he devoted to his king, that is King of France, Louis XIV. He addressed his other works to effective officials and ministers in the form of letters. He also compared India with European development as dull and cheerless. In 1670s to 71, Bernier's works were published and translated into English, Dutch, German and Italian. Between 1670 and 1725, his account was reprinted 8 times in French, and by 1684 it had been reprinted 3 times in English. This was in marked contrast to the accounts in Arabic and Persian, which circulated as manuscripts and were generally not published before 1800s. Making sense of an alien world, Al-Biruni and the Sanskritic tradition is our new topic. This topic is divided into 2 parts. Number 1, overcoming barriers to understanding, and the other one is Al-Biruni's description of the caste system. Overcoming barriers to understanding, this is our new topic. So take down a short question for this topic. The question is, what were the barriers that obstructed Al-Biruni's understanding? So there were 3 obstructions that always created some barriers for Al-Biruni. The first barrier was the language. And this language was so different that he could not even translate the ideas from one language to another. We are talking about Sanskrit. Sanskrit was prevalent in India during his visit, and Sanskrit and Arabic or Persian were not at all same. So the ideas were never translated or being shared or given from one person to another or from one place to another. Second barrier was the religious practices and beliefs. They were all those who visited India, or the travelers. We are talking about Al-Biruni. He was an Islam follower, so for him, he haven't seen the Hindu practices, so it was very difficult for him to understand what is what. The third barrier was a self-absorption and insularity of the local population. Means here, he found that the people easily do not absorb each other, means they don't welcome any ideas or any changes. Plus, if there are any people who are of low caste or they belong to high class, they just keep themselves separate from the local population. That means the high class do not go along with the low caste, or low caste they don't go along with the high caste. So that is what the barriers he found. So now we are moving on to our second topic of this portion. This is Al-Biruni's description to the caste system. Take a short question for this topic too. The question will be, describe Al-Biruni's description of the caste system. Al-Biruni described 4 social categories in ancient Persia: knights and princes, monks, fire priests, and lawyers and physicians, astronomers and other scientists, and peasants and artisans. In other words, he attempted to suggest that social divisions were not unique to India. As per Al-Biruni, the idea of social pollution naturally belonged to caste system, and this was against the law of nature. The influence of ideal Sanskrit study was observed on Al-Biruni's description about the caste system. The untouchables were defined as anti-Aja, often subjected to social oppression. Ibn Battuta and the excitement of the unfamiliar. This topic is divided into 3 headings: the coconut and the pan, Ibn Battuta and the Indian cities, and a unique system of communication. So let us first see what is the excitement all about. But you have to take down a small question. Give reasons why Ibn Battuta was full of excitement of the unfamiliar. So as you can look at the book 1 to 6, page number 1 to 6. By the time Ibn Battuta arrived in Delhi, that is in 14th century, whole of the subcontinent was a part of the global network of the communication. This communication network stretched from China in the east and northwestern Africa and Europe in the west. Ibn Battuta himself extensively traveled in these regions. During his journeys, he observed sacred places, spent time with scholars and rulers, and even remained on the post of Qazi. He also enjoyed the cosmopolitan culture of urban centers where people used to speak Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and other languages and exchange ideas, information, stories, etc. This includes stories of men noted for their piety, kings, general masses, and people of all categories. If anything was unfamiliar in those stories, it was particularly highlighted so that the readers or listeners must be impressed by that. Ibn Battuta very interestingly described the coconut and the pan. His readers were very much unfamiliar with these two things, the coconut and the pan. Let us see how Ibn Battuta describes this coconut and the pan. He says that these trees are among the most peculiar tree in kind and most astonishing in habit. They look exactly like date palms without any difference between them, except that the one produces nuts as its fruits and the other produces dates. The nut of a coconut tree resembles a man's head, for in it are what look like two eyes and a mouth, and the inside of it, when it is green, looks like the brain, and attached to it is a fiber which looks like hair. They make from this cords with which they sew up ships of iron nails, and they make from it cables for vessels. So these are the comparisons which he gave it for coconut, which they never seen. Now let us see what he talks about the pan. According to Ibn Battuta, he said that the betel is a tree which is cultivated in the same manner as the grapevine. The betel has no fruit and is grown only for the sake of its leaves. The manner of its use is that before eating it, one takes areca nut. This is like a nutmeg but is broken up until it is reduced into small pellets, and one places this in the mouth and chews them. Then he takes the leaves of the betel, puts a little chalk on them, and eats them up with the betel. This is what it describes about the pan. So in your slide I haven't described about pan because we all know what is pan, but we just have to make sure how we describe the pan. Okay, so now we'll be moving towards the Ibn Battuta and the Indian cities. So let's see what is the view of Indian cities according to Ibn Battuta. So here he says that the cities of India are full of opportunities for those who are rich or those who have necessary drive, resources and skills. They were densely populated and prosperous, except for the occasional disruption caused by wars and invasion. It appears from the Ibn Battuta's account that most cities had crowded streets and bright and colorful markets that were stacked with a wide variety of goods. He also described Delhi as a vast city with a great population, the largest in India. Okay, now Daulatabad, that is in Maharashtra, has no less and easily rivaled Delhi in size. So this is the view of Indian cities according to Ibn Battuta. Continuing with Ibn Battuta and the Indian cities. Here we see that bazaars were the hub of the social and cultural as well as economic activities. So with this we mean that bazaars were not only a place of selling or buying things, but it was also a place for gathering. Social and cultural activities used to take place out here. As in case, in the bazaars, there were some mosques or temples, and in this mosque and temples, some specific areas were left for singers, dancers or musicians, so that they can perform their own activities out there. Okay. Then he also described that the soil had a very fertile, or it has got very good fertility, and because of this there was a good agricultural production, and because of this agricultural production there was lots of wealth which was coming up after selling the surplus commodities or surplus agricultural production. Right now, the other thing that he also says that whatever things were produced out here were in great demand in West Asia and Southeast Asia. Out of this, some I have just mentioned in short, that is the textile, cotton cloth, fine muslin, silk, brocade and satin were in great demands. Okay, so now let us move on to our next topic, a unique system of communication. It is a very short topic, but it's a very important one. So you can note down a simple question for this, a probable question maybe. So the question can be like this: what has Ibn Battuta written about the postal system prevalent in India? So in my slide, I have shown you 3 points, or written 3 points. That is, postal system was very efficient. Now, when you talk about efficiency, it took very short period for them to deliver any kind of letters or messages. Okay, it does not take more than 1 year or 2 years, sometime maybe 30 days to 40 days. Okay, but according to Ibn Battuta, what he found interesting was like this. Okay, I'm just going away from what I have written. I'll just explain a few things a little more in detail. First of all, what he said is that after looking at the postal system, Ibn Battuta was very impressed because it was very efficient. Okay, very efficient way of postal system. It allowed merchants to send information and to transit money to far distance. So that made Ibn Battuta think that how it can be possible in this time. Then it also dispatched goods at a very short notice, as it is written in point number 1 that it used to take 50 days to deliver from Sindh or from Delhi to Sindh. But official reports took only 5 days. As you can see, it has got 2 different things written there. Means there were some type of dispatch or the postal system which was different for something and different for something. If it is a very important news, it can reach within 5 days, and if it is like ordinary one, it will take 50 days. So there were a system. Now Ibn Battuta mentioned that there were 2 types of postal system. One was known as uluk, which was on a horse post, okay, or done in horse. It was run by royal horses. Okay, its stations were set up at a distance of every 4 miles. When I say 4 miles, means after every 4 miles there was a station. As we can say, post offices, they had this mail stations. Okay, after every 4 miles, so that from point A to point B, okay, if there is any kind of transit, a man from point A will start for B, and from B it will come towards A. In the mid point, they will meet each other and they'll exchange the bags or the informations, and they can proceed towards their own places again. So it was an idea only. Okay, now the foot post was there again. Now the first one was uluk, horse post. Okay, now second one is the foot post, had 3 stations per mile. That was known as dawa. Okay, now remember it. Okay, that for horse post there were stations every after 4 miles, whereas for foot post there were stations every after mile. Okay, 3 stations per mile. You can see within a mile there will be 3 stations. Okay, at every third of a mile a populated village will be there, with 3 pavilion outside where men were greeted, okay, loins to ready to start. Now when I say this, it means that for foot post, now it is a horse and a man. I mean, when you compare, a horse will run faster than a man, but a horse cannot go everywhere where a man can go. Okay, a man can proceed towards any part of the terrain, whereas a horse will be little bit hesitant. Okay, so that makes, I'll just say, that makes a man little faster. Now a horse can continue to run for some miles, and thus there are a difference of 4 miles station. For us, whereas a man can be tired very, very soon. So what happens is that within every mile there will be 3 stations. Okay, and everyone is ready to run. As soon as they come to know that a male runner is approaching towards their station, they will also start. Means point A, I'm just taking an example, point A to point B. Okay, a man will be running from point A for point B. Okay, now a man from point B will also target to reach point A. So when they come, they'll come in the middle and they'll exchange the craft or their mail or their the messages. Okay, that is what they do. Now, inns and guest houses were supplied to all trade routes. That was very different thing which Ibn Battuta really appreciate. He never found all these things which was there in other places. But here, after coming to this part, he find it, wow, this is very interesting. Okay, now all these merchants were allowed to send information and send credit to long distances. So when you talk about long distances, means the merchants, they are very much happy to send whatever they want, because there are dispatches. Okay, now in your book, as you can see, a state, means the state evidently took special measures to encourage merchants. Now when I say merchants, means merchants are the sole wealth earner, we can say, for the state. So now if they don't like our system, they will not take interest in our system, that is postal system. So they said, if we increase the efficiency of the postal system, these merchants will take more interest, and then we can also earn some money. And thus you can see Ibn Battuta found that all these things are present in the system of communication which was found in this part of India. Okay, now the postal system was so efficient that, as I said, that it took 50 days to reach Delhi from Sindh, but the news reports of spies would reach the Sultan through the postal system in just 5 days. Bernier and the degenerate East. This is our next topic. Now this topic is divided into two parts or two subtopics. The question of land ownership, and the other one is a more complex social reality. Bernier and the degenerate East. The Troubles in the Mughal Empire. It's a book written by Bernier. Now in this work, he marked the detailed observation, critical insights, and the reflection which he noticed or which he saw in the Mughal India. He compared Mughal India with contemporary Europe, and in this comparison he said that Europe is far superior than the Mughal India. Bernier described the differences which he observed, that India seemed to be inferior to the Western world. And he said so because here he found that the Mughal India, or the kings, they look at the people as creatures. They don't do great things for the local public. And the local public also take the governance or the government or the kings as the superior, and they can decide upon their fates and all. That is why he said that I do not like the Indian way of governance. Okay, that is all about degenerate East. Right, now we are moving towards 6.1, the question of land ownership. So mark down a question for this topic. It will be like this: why did Bernier consider crown ownership of lands as disaster? So whatever comes after this is a part of the answer only. So you have to just describe it more properly according to the marks which will be asked. So let's start. Bernier mentioned that there was no provision of private property in Mughal India. So here we mean that in India or in Mughal India, nobody could own a private land, whereas in Europe, owning a land is considered to be the right of the people. Bernier described Indian society as consisting of undifferentiated masses of impoverished people, subjugated by a small minority of a very rich and powerful ruling class. Here what we are trying to understand is that in India we have a very less amount of people who are really rich, okay, and they are very powerful, but we have more people who are poor, who have nothing, or who are really in a very bad condition. But even though the number of rich people are less, then also they are dominating the poor people. So now moving to point number 3, during the Mughal Empire, the Shahana Shahi, that is king or sultan, owned all the land. he distributed the land among the nobles. Okay, the landholders were not allowed to pass their land to their children. Due to that, the people were not in favor to invest for the increasing or for production. The crown ownership land prevented the emergence of the improved classes or class the land as in Western Europe. It had oppressed the peasantry. When you talk about this, crown ownership of land means what? The crown or the king always owns the land. If suppose there is a land which belongs to Mr. A, okay, and after Mr. A's demise, the land will automatically go to the son, right, in present days. But during Mughal Empire, once the father dies, the land goes back to the king, and the king will decide to whom the land can be given. In that way, the people were very unhappy with this crown ownership. Now, there was no middle class in India. Bernier mentioned that Mughal king was a king of beggars and barbarians. The landholders were not allowed to pass their land to their children. Due to that, people were not in favor to invest for increasing the production. With this, we mean that when a farmer or when a landowner dies, okay, and then the land should go to the child or in the name of the child. But during the Mughal Empire or during the Mughal time, what happened was that after the death of the farmer, the land will not belong to the farmer's family. It directly goes to the hand of the king. That is why people really dislike to invest any kind of amount for increasing the production. Now, next point is the crown ownership land prevented the emergence of improved class or the landlord as in the West European areas. It had oppressed the peasantry. Now, with this point, we mean that the people, okay, the farmers will not be allowed to, improve their quality. In case if anyone who tries to improve, that person will not be considered as a part of the society, or the king's he will be punished. Why? Because if he improves, that means he will not depend on the king, and if he does not depend on the king, means he will not regard the king. That is why, what do during Mughal India? They try to control the peasantry, oppress the peasantry, right? Now, another thing that he said is that there was no middle class in India. So Bernier mentioned that Mughal king was the king of beggars and barbarians. He said so because the cities and towns were not in good condition. All the fields were full of bushes and marshes, and this happened because of the previous topic that we just saw. It means previous point, crown ownership, or not allowing people to maintain the land after the death of the person. That means if someone dies, the land does not belong to the family. That is why they thought, why to look after the land? Because once the sole earner, or once the farmer dies, the land will go to the king's hand. So they don't try to invest anything there. So in that way, the land remains full of marsh and bushes, right? Now, next point is Abul Fazl, a Mughal official of 16th century under Akbar's period, described the land revenue as a remuneration of sovereignty, and then there was also tax on crop, also made people not to work hard, because they try to see that whatever they do, they are always being oppressed by the kings, and also they say that no, this is not the kind of thing that we should continue with. Thus the condition of the people became more worse and worse, but then also they don't try to fulfill the orders of the king, because they know even if the land is good, after all, at last, once the family or once the farmer dies, it will not go to the son, it will go to the king. That is why they don't look into cultivation. Then French philosopher Montesquieu expressed that the rulers of Asia enjoyed a complete authority over their subjects. That is what we said. The king of this time, okay, as mentioned by the French philosopher, saying that the king of this time, they try to control the subject when you say the ordinary people, and they try to manipulate in all the way they like, okay, let it be in the in the case of earning money or in taxation, selling, buying, whatever it is. Okay, so that is why this part of the area was very bad as per Bernier. Bernier's descriptions influenced Western theorists from the 18th century onwards. The idea of the French philosopher Montaigne was further developed as a concept of ascetic mode of production by Karl Marx in the 19th century. Then he said that in India before colonialism, surplus was appropriated by the state, which led to the emergence of a society that was composed of large number of autonomous and village communities who were trying to control the poor people. So the imperial court, after knowing all these things, they respected the autonomy of the village communities, and so the imperial court respected the autonomy of the village communities. And what did they do is they started a stagnant system in the villages. Now when we say stagnant system, it means the surplus commodities or the surplus items should be the sole ownership of the surplus commodity should be on the hands of the farmers. It should not be on the hands of the kings or the autonomous rulers and all. So now let us move on to our next subtopic, that is a more complex social reality. Under this, you take down a small question. It goes like this: explain the views of Bernier about the more complex social reality of the Mughal Empire. Okay, so under this, once again I have divided the topic into few points. So these points can be written as your answer, but you have to little bit elaborate them. So point number 1, Bernier mentioned that Mughal Empire was not for ordinary people. It was trying to control people by disregarding their rights, by punishing them, by oppressing them. In other words, we can say it was tyrannical. So the artisans were never motivated to improve the quality of their products because the profits were shared by the states. Very simple way we can say that whatever the artisan earns, it cannot be in the hands of the artisan. You have to share it with the Mughal Empire. That is why the people really don't want to improve their quality. Then next is manufacturers exported in exchange of good and silver. He also observed the presence of rich community and was engaged in far distant exchange. Now this point means that there were lots of manufacturers, exporting or trading in gold and silver, and this rich community was almost there, and they are dealing with far distance exchange. 15% of the population lived in town during the 17th century, and the ratio was counted much better than the ratio of the urban population of Europe. According to Bernier, this was good. That is, the number of population was good than compared to Europe in the 15th century. But the condition was really bad. You can see that one. According to Bernier, Mughal towns were considered as camp towns. Now, camp town means what? When a town which is all around the empire, if there is king's palace, and nearby the king's palace if there are some towns, these towns totally depend on the king and its way of running, for growing, for cultivating, for living, for whatever they want. It all depends on the king. You are not free to do what you like, but you have to do according to the king. Means if he says you have to grow this crop, you have to grow, either you like it or not. There is no question, but everything is dependent upon imperial camps for the development. That was known as a camp town. Now many kind of towns also existed at that time, such as manufacturing towns. What does manufacturing means? They used to manufacture different types of items. Trading town means thus they do what? Trade only. Port towns, now this is meant for communication, port, where nearby the sea or nearby the river and all. sacred or religious center. These are basically for social life or for the religious life. Okay, then pilgrimage towns means people moving from one place to another, not for jobs but for case of devotion. Okay, they are moving from one place to another. That is pilgrimage town. All these towns developed during the Mughal towns. Okay, now merchants had strong cooperation with Kimtin, or in the circle of their caste and professional bodies, and such groups were known as Mahajans, and their head was Seth. Merchants had strong cooperation and keen ties in the circle of their caste and professional bodies, and such groups were known as Mahajans, and their head as Seth. Now what do you understand from this? The merchants, when you talk about merchants, the businessmen, okay, they had a very good relationship. Now why the relationship was good? Because whoever is dealing belongs to their family or family members. Okay, and then the professional bodies and everything were almost from their family. So what do? They had a very good communication among them. Okay, and the head of all these merchants and all was known as Seth. Now the last point of this slide is that all Mahajans were represented by the head of the merchant group, which was known as Nagar Seth. Now this means nothing else, but here what they are telling us is every Mahajan is or represented by the head of a group, and the head of the group means Nagar Seth. Nagar means the town, okay, the Seth of the town. There were many urban groups which described as physicians, which is also known as Hakim or Ved, teachers, Pandit or Mullah, lawyers, painters, architects, musicians, calligraphers, etc. Now all this type of people were found in these areas, but these are not for ordinary people. Basically they will be teaching only the high class or maybe little bit of those who have got money. Some of that groups were dependent on imperial guardianship. Few of them lived by serving the protectors and served the common people in crowded market. Now with this point we say that there are some people who are, for their lifetime, they just work as a protector, bodyguards of the kings and queens. Okay, and they serve the common people sometime in the crowded market by what? By doing their duty, standing or guarding the guardians. That is what the part says, that it is all about the complex society or the reality of the complex society. Right now we are moving towards the last part of the chapter. This is all about women, slaves, sati and laborers. Okay, so now take down a small question for this once again. Now this topic has got two questions. One is explain why Ibn Battuta described about the slaves in India, and the other question will be explain how the accounts of Ibn Battuta and Bernier provide us the tantalizing glimpses of the life of Indian women during the 16th and 17th century. So now these two questions are the probable questions. So what you are going to study from here is, once again I'm just telling you, it does the small points, so you have to elaborate it beautifully. Okay, try to understand. Now the first point under this is that Ibn Battuta was a foreign ruler or a traveler who visited India during reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Now his works throw the light in the society. Whose society, or which society we are talking about? It is not the society where he belongs to. He came to India and he found different things. So whatever he wrote is on our society only. He reached Sindh along with horses, camels, and purchased slaves as gift for Sultan, where he realized that here not only animals are sold, but you can even buy a slave for yourself, and that too a lady slave, or we can say a woman. So when Ibn Battuta reached Sindh, he purchased horses, camels and slaves, and he bought it for Sultan, okay, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. So when he reached Multan, he presented the governor with a slave and a horse together with raisin and almonds. Now, Muhammad bin Tughlaq informs Ibn Battuta that he was very happy with the sermon of a preacher named Nasiruddin that he gave him 100,000 coins and 200 slaves. See now, once again, a coin. Okay, we are happy with the monetary help, but why we are given slaves? That also not one but 200 slaves. And you see, these slaves will not be only men, but it will be women. It appears from Ibn Battuta's account that there was considerable differences among slaves. Some female slaves in the service of Sultan were experts in music and dance, and he also enjoyed their performances at the Sultan's marriage. Now, there were also female slaves who were employed by the Sultan to keep a watch on his nobles, so as spies. Then there were also slaves which are generally used for domestic labors, and Ibn Battuta found that their services particularly indispensable for carrying women and men on palanquins or doli. Now, the price of slaves, particularly female slaves required for domestic labor, was very low, and most families who could afford to do so kept at least one or two of them. So what we came to know is that there was also difference in the wage system. A man will get more, a man slave will get more, whereas a women's slave will get less, even though they are doing same type of job. Now, contemporary European travelers, they have highlighted that the treatment to the woman was a very crucial difference between the European and the Indian or the Eastern and the Western societies. Now, Bernier, he said, what kind of difference is there? He said, I am taking an example of the sati. That is a word of Bernier. He said, I can differentiate East and West by one practice, that is sati. And he said that while women seem to embrace death cheerfully, others often forced to die. Means there were sometimes women who chose to die on their own, and if someone who doesn't do it, she will be forced to jump on the fire. Now, however, women's life resolved around much else beside the practice of sati. I mean, it was not only on sati, but there are many things else, many other things which also describes that women were in very bad condition. Their labor was crucial in both agriculture and non-agricultural production, but still they are not regarded as human beings. Means they are regarded very low-grade people. Women from merchant families participated in commercial activities, sometimes even taking mercantile disputes to the court of law. It is therefore seems unlikely that women were confined to the private spaces of their homes. In some cases, women were given some freedom. Like, as I just read out, in some families, merchant families, women can do some kind of trade, or if there is any kind of disputes, they can even go to the court of laws in the absence of the husband or in the death of the husband. So this type of things slowly was seen in some of the areas, but not everywhere, and that is why he said that women were regarded very badly, or women were regarded low grade in the Indian society. Okay, so with this we came to the end of the chapter, and if there is any doubt or any other questions raised, you can just text me directly in my number. Thank you.